Welcome, everybody, to one of the most important panels of the day, if not the year, because this really is at the epicenter of fighting climate change as well as sustainable development in the areas where it matters the most. Let's get started with the idea of real estate and the place that it has in global climate change, in combating climate change. Just to give you some perspective, cities account for 2% of the world's landmass and more than 60% of the emissions, this according to the United Nations. And buildings account for a significant proportion of that. One study just recently came out saying about 30% of all urban emissions could be cut by 2050 by making buildings more efficient. I don't need to talk about it. The people who are the experts are here with us who can really talk about it much better than I. Let's bring them in. Kathleen McCarthy, global co-head of real estate at Blackstone, which is one of the world's biggest real estate owners with $187 billion under management. And Tony Malkin, who really is a leader in sustainable real estate on many different levels, chairman and chief executive officer of Empire State Realty Trust, owners, of course, of the Empire State Building, which was absolutely a pioneer in sustainable buildings, and who's also played an instrumental role in some of the regulations around getting this to happen. So I want to start this conversation with a big picture question, Kathleen. Is talking about greener buildings the appropriate way to really be talking about this?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Lisa. This will be a great conversation. I'd say absolutely. Green in a building context is about sustainability and strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and impact on the planet. And as you said, buildings are a big part of the emissions impact. And I think there's a lot of ways we can, at a tactical level and across the canvas we have, for example, in our business, have a huge impact on the planet in a positive way.
Tony?
I think the one thing I would add to Kathleen's comment is that the fact that cities are the most efficient way to deliver work, health services, retail services, life services. So while we consume and produce on the margin, as you measure it, much more than other places, relatively speaking, the efficiency per person, per resident, per worker is much, much higher. So it's a great place to focus, a great place to work on improving things.
Well, when you talk about green buildings, is there a model of what that means in terms of, is it cutting emissions? Is it having a certain type of materials involved? Tony, I want to start with you on that.
So I'd say there are three things. It's energy efficiency, number one. Number two, it's healthy buildings. And number two, it's indoor environmental quality. So we need to create environments in which workers can work healthily. We need to remove off-gassing organic materials. We need to make sure the air is clean, refreshed. In the case of COVID, active bipolar ionization produces a clean interior, clean air for people to breathe. And then in the last instance, though, the first point made, energy efficiency is critical. Energy is what creates carbon, and to the extent we are going to have carbon in the production of energy, we need to reduce our energy consumption.
Kathleen, how easy is it to have criteria and measure the greenness, for lack of a better word, of a building?
Well, I would say, having criteria is not particularly hard. Measuring is a challenge, but I think it's vitally important. We know in life that what gets measured matters and therefore gets managed. And so a big part of how we approach our climate initiatives, our sustainability initiatives, is around setting targets. So, for example, our firm recently announced that for all new control investments, we're going to aim to reduce emissions by 15% over the first few years that we hold the assets. And I think that's a nice thing to say, but you have to be able to measure where you start and how you're making progress toward that goal and have you achieved it. Building off something Tony said in his last answer, I'd say, historically, I think a lot of the ways people thought about green and green buildings was really against a design standard where you were thinking about green roofs and bicycles and whether you have LED lighting, and all of those things are important. But I'd say really the opportunity we have as owners of large-scale real estate, for example, for us, our portfolio is about $370 billion of real estate around the globe. Tony operates huge assets in one of the most important markets for this kind of work.
Compared to Kathleen.
Is that, I think the way we think about it is, you have an opportunity to start and lead with operational interventions, and then try to move these assets along a hierarchy of carbon reduction. And you need to be measuring all along the way, because you are starting with the things that are more capital light in terms of your intervention. So I mentioned LED lighting or optimizing building systems. But then you have to move it along to have a real impact. You have to make significant capital investments, and you have to be well-capitalized owners. It really does advantage folks like Empire State and Blackstone, who not only have the assets to do the work against, but have the capital to attribute to it. And once you can get the equipment better, then you can start thinking about, where does the power come from? Do you have the ability to produce renewable power on site? Can you buy that from the grid? Is there more renewable power available? And so I think, all of us, what we're trying to do is take stock of where we are and then measure along the way as we move through this hierarchy.
And there's a lot packed in there, including the investment and what's required to retrofit buildings and how to make things more efficient. Before we dig into some of the details of that, Tony, can you give a sense of what proportion of buildings have been retrofitted or have complied on some level with the current standards for regulation for emissions for buildings?
Well, I think you have to get right to the question of what are the current standards for regulations for buildings. And the reality is that on a national level, we have no standards, but we have the ability within the federal government to collect data, analyze data, and provide voluntary standards. On a state level, we have begun to look at states as far as what their objectives are with regard to their grids, and New York State has some very progressive goals towards this. By the way, states around the country have begun to focus on this. On a city level, there's where a lot of legislation has begun to take place. And there you begin to see this dialectic between the standards which they seek to establish and the fact that they really don't have the capacity to process, analyze, collect, and understand the data. So in New York City, for instance, when they've begun to rate buildings, not standards yet of how you're supposed to perform, but rate buildings through Local Law 87, what they actually did was use a federal standard and a federal tool, the Environmental Protection Agency's portfolio manager, to accumulate data and provide the ratings. Now with Local Law 97, we begin to have not so much necessarily standards for performance, yet well-defined overall objectives for the entire building stock within the city. And I'm actually on the Mayor's Advisory Board for the implementation of Local Law 97, where we then try to take that objective and to look at building typologies and to understand universities, hospitals, retail, cold storage, warehouse distribution, office, residential. What are the contributions that they can make? How do they get there in order to achieve these results? So very much to Kathleen's comment, got to get away, I think, from the comment of green in the classic sense. I think that was really taken by the U.S. Green Building Council, and a lot of focus on LEED with bike racks, showers, plant walls, water features, signage, which really did start the conversation and I think are very useful. In the end, however, if you want to change the world and you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's not how you get there. It's exactly what Kathleen said. What can be what we like to say is what can be modeled, can then be implemented, can then be measured and verified. And that's what this really gets to, is the data. So the standards have yet to be established. We are very active with the Real Estate Roundtable, both Kathleen and I, to work with the government, with the Biden administration now, but we've worked with 3 prior administrations towards the assembly and analysis of data to provide the opportunity to inform state and local legislation towards actual standards.
Kathleen, what's your sense of how cities are doing with respect to complying in a sort of wholesale manner in the real estate that you look at as a potential investment?
Well, as Tony said, and I'll step out of New York City and operate, talk about how things are looking around the world. I'd say different cities and different governments are taking different approaches, but increasingly we are seeing a regulation-led approach. And some of that's driven because countries have made commitments, for example, to the Paris Climate Accords, which I'd say we support wholeheartedly, but because those commitments were made and then governments turn around and say, well, how do I actually implement against that? And that's where they need the private sector. And so regulation can help with that. And again, different places are in different positions. But one of the things we're really encouraged by is some of what we see coming out in Europe and taking hold, in that it's not just about regulations with sticks, if you will, attached to them, fines, penalties, et cetera, but really programmatic approaches to try to incentivize owners, incentivize capital to make progress against sustainability goals. So, for example, in our business in Europe, we've been able to access two things. One thing is known as a green bond. Something else is called a sustainability-linked bond. In each of these cases, you can sometimes qualify if your real estate itself meets certain requirements, but particularly with the sustainability-linked bonds, you can actually qualify into the bonds, but then keep them so long as you're making progress against certain sustainability goals. And in each case, we're really motivated not just because we care a lot about this subject, which we do, but also because it has a real impact in a positive way for our investors by reducing our borrowing costs, in many cases by 10% or more. And so I think what that European market has recognized is, hey, if we can take owners and say you can reduce your borrowing costs, that'll incentivize you into the behavior we want by attracting more capital into your capital stacks. It's, I think, a very effective way for governments to really approach this partnership with the private sector.
So, Tony, what are some of the most efficient ways of using capital to reduce emissions, right? I mean, we think about, for example, LED lights, and you're talking about the operational aspects that perhaps are less expensive. What are some of the other more progressed areas to target for buildings that you're seeing, putting aside regulations, but perhaps being adapted by some of the regulators?
So I think it's very important just to begin with an understanding there is no silver bullet for this. There's silver buckshot. So if you want to look at the work we did at the Empire State Building, which was absolutely groundbreaking work, what I like to call ESRT version 1.0, and we're in the midst of, and we'll soon reveal ESRT version 2.0. But we looked at 64 different measures, and we looked at how they would work in concert and integrate them into a renovation which we already had planned at the Empire State Building. And we took the lessons that we learned there, by the way, and we rolled them out through our whole portfolio. In the Empire State Building, these 8 measures, which included improved thermal barrier through upgrading our windows, improving the insulation between the perimeter radiators and the exterior walls, heating and cooling controls, digital controls, the largest wireless building energy management system in the world. You look at these 8 different measures together, we've reduced our total energy consumption off our baseline by 40%. Now, when you reduce energy, as I said, you reduce carbon. So our goal here is to look at all of these measures individually. There's no one. So now in version 2.0, we have now looked at over 150 different measures, products, services, things that can be installed, ways things can be monitored and measured. And then the next thing is you have to understand that tenants, users, have a tremendous amount to do with what the actual consumption profile looks like, right? So in residential, it's the apartment user. In logistics, it's the actual tenant inside the space. And in office buildings, which is our primary focus, approximately 55 to 60% of all the energy consumed is consumed within the tenant space. So we started a project called the Tenant Energy Optimization Program, which is available at the Urban Land Institute. And I did this as a philanthropic initiative with some other foundations, my own, and our own work. And it establishes the process of how you design and build out energy-efficient tenant spaces. And then through my role with the Real Estate Roundtable, where I chaired the Sustainability Policy Advisory Committee, we actually got a bill passed in Congress back in 2015, which would expand Energy Star, which is a measure for energy consumption, to tenant spaces, not just buildings. Believe it or not, it took a while, but after that bill passed, it is now fully implemented, and it's another way. Instead of having a LEED insignia on your office, which says, oh, you conserve water and waste diversion, all those things, which are nice, this is hardcore. Have you reduced your energy consumption? And then I think the other important thing to do is to maintain commissioning. It's not the Ronco turkey roaster. You do not set it and forget it. You've got to work with it every month, every quarter, every year, because workers go in and do work, they change systems, sensors might not be functioning. You have to maintain, so it's a constant recommissioning. The results, however, can be very significant. And we've targeted the maximum that we feel we can reduce in the consumption of the Empire State Building through our version 2.0. We'll reduce those findings shortly, along with the costs to get there. In the meantime, I think it's very important that we have shared all our work. ESBNYC.com has a sustainability section that lists everything that we've done and how we did it. The Tenant Energy Optimization Program that resides at Urban Land Institute provides instruction and case studies for architects, brokers, engineers, owners, managers, tenants. How do you do the work? Share this information, spur change.
Well, and that, Kathleen, that kind of goes to the heart of the question: how do you scale up some of these solutions, which, to quote Tony, are more like silver buckshot rather than a silver bullet? The idea here that you're targeting a moving target, first of all, you're dealing with different buildings, you're dealing with different tenants. This isn't just sort of a cookie cutter kind of approach. How do you then scale up and provide the capital when it's from investors who want returns and it might not be as obvious in the near term?
Well, I'd start by saying that I think these goals are totally aligned, right? When you have good sustainability projects, when you are ESG oriented, and you are making buildings more efficient, more attractive places to work. Tony highlighted wellness and how important that is, not only for the planet, but for the people in the building. I think this is completely aligned with generating great returns for investors. And by the way, I think our investors see that as well as part of the project we have of generating value in the investments we make. I'd say, though, it does require a lot of resources and as we talked about before, a lot of capital in some cases to really address the opportunities that exist to reduce the impact of greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce water usage, to reduce waste. And so from our standpoint, we've tried to create a great partnership between people we have at Blackstone, both leaders in this space specifically. We last year hired a head of ESG. I mentioned when we were preparing for the conversation, Tony had helped, and his team helped us find a terrific person to lead that initiative. He is setting up deputies all around the world because you can't, from our perspective, do this really effectively in Australia, just sitting in New York. And likewise, Europe gives us a great opportunity as well. So we have people here. We rely very extensively also on really critical external consultants. We've created a partnership with Schneider Electric, back to the comment about how do you measure. We've needed to bring them in to help us really assess where we are at and measure progress in terms of our energy consumption. And then finally, I think the most exciting opportunity for us at our scale is that we can partner with all of our portfolio companies so that each of them is working on sustainability in their own space-appropriate way. So, for example, we have apartment buildings, and in one case in New York, the properties at Stuytown were conducive to installing solar on the roofs, which has reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by about 17% since we started that project. We have a warehouse company. It's one of the largest owners of warehouses in America, called Link. They just released a target of carbon neutrality by 2025. And in that case, it's going to be a combination of those kind of energy efficient lighting systems. It's additionally working to install solar, and then over time thinking about how we try to access renewables through the grid. Those are examples where the buildings themselves are quite conducive to kind of moving in a green direction because of what we can do with renewable power and other programming. Other assets aren't so much that way, but we're working with each of our portfolio companies so they can say, if we're an office company or we're a hotel company, what can we be doing with our sustainability programs to reduce our impact on the planet? And that's where we have an opportunity for really extensive reach. But it takes people and it takes capital.
Yeah, I might add one thing here, which you have to recognize. It's not just at the cost. We believe that this is virtually impact investing. And I think that most people think of impact investing as working in deprived and underprivileged neighborhoods, affordable housing, things of that nature. It's not just where people live, number one. It's where they work, and it's what happens where they work. Number two, I think it's extremely important to recognize, I believe, that in the next 5 to 7 years, you will see a lower multiple on exit, a higher cap rate on assets that are not healthy, that do not provide indoor environmental quality, and then are not energy efficient, because that will reflect a liability. So what we do right now is we future-proof our assets by the work we do. And let's recognize, yes, it is a big hill to climb, but you start at the bottom. All right, so you pick up the fruit that's lying on the ground, you grab the low-hanging fruit, and you move your way up the tree of opportunity. And you have to do it not in an ideological way. You have to do it in a fact-based way with modeling, implementation, monitoring, and verification, and continued recommissioning. And it works. It also creates jobs. And it creates local jobs. You can't export one of these jobs. And it is, as you mentioned, it's really customized to the use and the type of asset. It's really a wonderful thing to figure out and to see it work.
Well, Kathleen, what Tony is talking about really goes to how you look at environmentally friendly buildings in terms of investments. I mean, is it that you're looking for buildings that are already outfitted in a certain way to be efficient? Are you looking for buildings that aren't, that you could invest in, that then will have a higher return on investment at the outset if you decide to sell? Can you talk about some of the ways that you use these criteria?
Well, our job is to find the best real estate investment opportunities we can for our investors. And we do not have a screen that says we only buy it if it's already meeting certain green standards, or we only buy it if we have an opportunity to have the biggest possible impact in making it more green. We look at the best possible real estate assets, and then we bring our program, which, I love how Tony has framed that this isn't just a kind of a one day you check the box and you're done the work. You're at it every single day, all the time. And I think what we find in all of our investments is that where there's an opportunity for operational intervention, whether that's for typical and traditional real estate execution, or for now bringing our program in terms of sustainability, I think we're excited, and our teams are really happy to activate. One investment of ours that comes to mind is we own a very large resort in Hawaii. It's got a pool system that your children would love to come check out. But it's a big consumer. Sure. It consumes energy and it consumes a lot of water. And so one of our goals when we bought the asset was that we really wanted to set out to reduce water consumption. But it has been work every day. We invested $1 million to install green turf so we weren't irrigating the property, to fix leaks, to have better water systems. But we kept at it. And when the pandemic hit and occupancy went down and we expected to see all this water savings and we didn't, we said, okay, there's more work to do. We sort of keep going. So again, we think there's going to be lots of opportunities at the assets we buy. As we went back to at the beginning, typically speaking, the general real estate stock we have available to invest in is probably not as energy efficient as we'd all like it to be, but we can take it there.
Tony, you were nodding, and I'm wondering if you want to add on to that, or to end with this idea of the biggest disconnect between some of those investments and the regulatory front, that we're sort of bringing together what's reality in terms of what you can measure and what you can invest, and what's sort of being aspired to on the regulatory front.
I'd just say on the regulatory front that it's extremely important that policy is informed by practice. Okay, we are very early in this journey. Most of the work that's been done to date has been directional in nature. Europe is very far ahead. The European Union has established, I think it's a $400 billion number within their budget for the retrofitting of existing buildings for energy efficiency. 90 to 95% of all the buildings that are going to be around in 2030, even 2035, are here already. So we need to work on the existing building stock, and we need to make this available in a way for everybody, not just high-profile projects. So the regulatory environment needs to be informed by practice. We have good practice. We develop new practice. It's part of what we're doing in version 2.0 of ESRT's work. And we need to communicate well with legislators, and legislators on state and local levels, as well as the federal, must be able to cooperate with us and take in our information. So we get away from the scavenger hunt from points or something like LEAD, and we get into data analysis, monitor, verify based on modeling, and we move up the tree of opportunity.
So ultimately, are you optimistic that we could reach this goal, just really quickly, of reducing emissions from buildings by 30% by 2050, or do you think it'll be sooner than that? Kathleen?
I think, sorry, go ahead, Doug. I think there's certainly
absolutely.
An opportunity.
That's a low target. That's a low target.
Yeah.
All right.
But I think I was just going to say that, but as Tony said, I think we need to make this also a very inclusive project, right? There have to be means and motivations for the entire community of real estate investors to contribute to this work.